Good evening, everybody. It's Aaron Solomons again from Freedivers. We teach all levels of AIDA courses, and we also do training, both for all levels of divers, from people who've just passed a course up to people who want to do records. We also have a remote coaching problem. Let's get one thing clear this evening before we begin. The blue shirt that I'm wearing has nothing whatsoever to do with the Chelsea Football Club or their aspirations tonight. It just happens to be a color that I like. Okay, there was an interesting discussion on Deeper Blue which people may have been following, and I'd like to talk about it because I was surprised at some of the reactions. There was an announcement by the persistent team, Pippin that he was going to do 5 dives to 100 meters, that's of course no limits, in the space of half an hour. And immediately there was an almost hysterical reaction by an awful lot of listeners. I'd like to talk about this because it also shows, to me, certain gaps in knowledge. And it also illustrates certain things that we have been talking about for some time. So bear with me here. I have known Pippin since 1992. I've trained with him in Cuba. And I've known him both as a friend and through an awful lot of incarnations. And I have had some idea of the strengths and weaknesses of the man. Now, here's the thing. People seem to have a model in their head of decompression sickness. And I was surprised to see that there were an awful lot of scientists of various persuasions and experience that joined the discussion and were lifted their hands in holy horror and were absolutely horrified by this and said it was certain death. Well, first of all, it would be quite an operational performance, logistical performance, to be able to do 500-meter dives in no limits within half an hour. You would either have to have divers down there well, let's put it this way. You've got a problem to recover the weights after each dive. Pippin's sled is a 2-part sled. That means, say, you go down, the weights are in the bottom part of the sled. It's knees first, the position of going down, and there's a snap shackle that joins the 2 parts of the sled. Now, what happens when you go down there, when you're at the bottom, you reach your hand into the lift bag, inflate the tank. At least that was the old system. He may have put the tank in a different place. It's really immaterial. You inflate the lift bag, let's say open the tap of the tank, and release the upper part of the sled from the weights that are on the bottom. You go sailing up to the surface and hopefully let go of the sled before you get to the surface. he may not. And then you are left with the problem of recovering the weights, which may mean recovering the entire line or having divers down there which will hook something onto the lift bag onto the weight, send it up and reattach it. Now, all that requires quite a lot of fiddling around with, and I very much doubt whether 5 dives within half an hour are actually a physical possibility. But let's not take the half-hour thing too seriously. I think the horror came of the idea of doing 5 dives in, let's say, a fairly short interval. And this seemed to exceed any possible projected model for decompression sickness. That's to say that, in other words, according to the pundits, you were absolutely certain to get decompression sickness immediately from that. And I don't think that if we'd asked them, well, if we're talking about doing 5 dives in an hour, let's say, would that substantially alter your answer? And I've talked to a few of them in private and said, no, absolutely not. Doesn't matter whether it's half an hour or an hour. 5 dives, 100 meters, absolutely impossible. Now, we're faced with a bit of a problem here, and this is a problem that we should understand, because it also may point to directions that might be very profitable for us to understand. The first thing is that most of the statistics on decompression sickness in freediving have been compiled from accidents. Now, very little has been factored into the conclusions that people have drawn from this in investigating what techniques the diver actually employed. Now, here's the thing. There are at least 2 techniques of Pippin's that would give him less exposure to decompression sickness. First of all, let me say something else here. That this is the way he used to train. A lot of dives, over 100 meters, in a very short period of time. A student of his, who was Benjamin France, and I'm not quite sure how close a student, but I think he was, because he himself admitted that most of his techniques and nearly all his knowledge came from Pippin, did end up eventually getting very difficult to say whether it was an aneurysm in the brain or whether it was actually decompression sickness. I don't really remember, but he ended up paralyzed on the surface, and he had been doing, understand this, 4 dives in the morning to over 120 meters, followed by, in the afternoon, 4 dives to 100 meters with long hangs at 100 meters. And whether they were 2 or 3 minute hangs, I don't know, but there was, or they may have even exceeded that, but they were considerable length of time on the bottom at 100 meters. So that's 8 dives a day to over 100 meters or over. And he had been doing that for some considerable time before he actually had his accident. There was another tragic case which happened in Nice. I think it was in 92 or 93, of a young man who was a very promising freediver called Cyril Isoardi, who had been training with Pippin in Cuba. Cyril came back from Cuba and was training virtually alone. He was training, I believe, with his brother or a very close relative, who helped him with a sled, but did not apparently get into the water at all. And that's all the safety that he had. He did 5 dives in a day to over 100 meters. I don't remember exactly how much over 100 meters. It was somewhere between, I think, 100 and 120. And the 5th one, he didn't return to the surface. Okay. But he had been training for some considerable period of time. And what Pippin proposed was not doing 8 dives, he proposed doing 4 dives and a one-shot deal, which is different from the accumulative effects of consecutive days of doing this kind of training. I am not recommending it in any way. I am just saying that the reaction I found to be virtually bordering on the hysterical. We even had cases of Pippin should be warned. Yeah, right. Who's the volunteer? Let's really understand what happens here. This might be the best illustration of the fact that for very deep diving, packing is not a good idea. One of the things that may have saved Pippin, and one of the things that may have prevented his students, at least for a very long time, from getting a decompression problem, was the fact that they didn't pack. I have a suspicion, and this is purely working on logic, that packing puts you into a far higher risk of decompression sickness. Now, when statistics on decompression sickness are being gathered, there's a doctor whose name I forget in Dahab, and there are other doctors in Sharm, etc., in our immediate area, who have, I believe, a considerable body of statistics of decompression accidents from freediving. But I'm not sure whether there has been a careful notation at any stage of whether the diver packed, and if so, how much. The other thing that I think that packing, this is why I'm having a real go at this today, the other thing that packing does, which is maybe even more of a risk, is that it puts you into a much higher risk category for a nitrogen narcosis. Tanya Streeter's famous 160-meter no-limit dive, we can see her completely losing the plot for, I think it was something like 17 seconds at 160 meters because she was stoned out of a tree. She also had a near accident on the surface, if you like it, an ischemic blackout, by overpacking on the surface, where she actually blacked out, and then the judges allowed her to start again and go down for the dive. Frankly, an appalling idea. Okay, bad idea, but here's the ticket. Are the records, or depth records here, not pool records, are the depth records really dependent on the fact that I can pack? The answer to that one, I am absolutely convinced, is no. Here again, we have to have an understanding of how we pack. A person who is submerged up to their collarbone level in the water and who is ventilating and packing in a vertical position, it's very difficult for them to overpack. Aleksei, by his own admission, packs only enough to, if you like it, compensate for the difference between a full lung taken on the surface and a full lung taken when the diaphragm is 60 centimeters down. Now, here's an interesting fact. This was also in a discussion, I believe it was on VertBlue right now. We have to understand a few things here. You're not only dealing with loss of volume. The loss of volume in your lungs when you're submerged to here may be very small, insignificant virtually. Well, not insignificant, but it may be, I don't know, 10 or 12%. But much more importantly, the effort involved in taking a full breath or in packing, let's say the effort involved in taking a full breath is very much greater. You're not only dealing with the pressure exerted against the diaphragm. The diaphragm, don't forget, moves down as you breathe in. And it's working against water pressure. And there's probably a 45 to 60 centimeter depth at which your diaphragm is. But that isn't the worst of the story. All the stuff that you got below your diaphragm, your abdomen, yeah, and everything that's in it, all your innards, your stomach, your bowels, your intestine, your kidneys, your liver, your everything else that's there, the whole works, is not an airspace, gentlemen. That means to say it behaves like a liquid. A liquid, yeah, cannot be compressed, but it does transfer pressure. So, in other words, the pressure acting on the whole abdominal area is being transferred as a resistance to the diaphragm descending as you're breathing in. Okay, so what's happening is I'm not breathing in so much. My packs are, you will find that somebody packing in a vertical position like that, to achieve the same volume, let's say that he could achieve with 4 packs on the surface, might take in that position 10 to 12 packs to achieve the same volume. So there we have it. So packing is a thing that I think will disappear from deep freediving because of the risks both of narcosis and of decompression sickness are very considerable. Decompression sickness probably only if somebody is doing multiple dives or incredibly deep dives, which are probably sled dives. Unless somebody is packing monstrously, it's difficult to conceive at the depths that we are doing outside the sled disciplines of somebody being able to get a severe decompression sickness at the depths that we're at today. The depths that we're at tomorrow, we're going to have to review this and look at it very carefully again. But unquestionably, it's responsible for people getting knocked out of their skull at depth. Earlier, that means to say at a shallower depth, and more severely. And this in itself can cause accidents. Sometimes the accidents are virtually lead one into the realm, the near accidents lead one into the realm of the Superman. Aleksei Molchanov at the last VertBlue did a constant weight dive from which he emerged absolutely clean to what was virtually 130 meters. It was 129 point something. Now, as I understand the story, he descended below the plate and was looking for the tags. Okay, there may have been a lot of factors involved here. I wasn't there. I did notice that the tags were black with a small orange spot on a black plate. I did notice that Aleksei, who might have gone sailing past because he happened to have a long leash, as long as one is allowed, which has now been extended, I believe, to 1.5 meters. But basically, he was down there also for an awfully long time trying to find the tag, which was actually above him. By his own admission, I understand that an awful lot of that was due to narcosis. If it had been somebody else, this might have ended very, very badly. And luckily, he is a moderate to minimal packer. So I think we have to draw conclusions from this. Let me come back to the Pippin thing, where people were getting, as I said, nearly hysterical about, oh, this is a certain death, etc., etc., etc. Well, Pippin himself had been training an awfully long time that way, yeah, and so had some of his earlier students, at least. So it's not something that hasn't been done before. Okay. We mentioned one thing, and we said that there were two. We mentioned one thing that possibly gave him less exposure to decompression sickness. The other thing, the other technique that Pippin has evolved, which may be his legacy to freediving, because it's incredibly interesting one, is the fact that he floods his sinus, middle ear, etc., etc., on the way down. Now, depending at the depth, I mean, initially Pippin told me himself that he was flooding somewhere between 80 and 90 meters. That's when there's minimal air pressure in the sinuses to oppose the entry of seawater, so that you can digitally control the amount of seawater entering. And if you can get used to the sensation, after that, after you've flooded, there is absolutely no need to equalize, and you can drop as fast as you like. You don't have to respect 3 meters a second or something like this is the absolute maximum at which somebody can equalize their ears, because you don't have to equalize after that. So here again, minimal or less exposure both to narcosis and to decompression sickness by this technique. Nobody has really perfected it except the Greek sponge divers, in a head-down position. The Greek sponge divers managed to flood their ears, sinuses, etc., simply because when they first began free diving as a young man, they burst their eardrums, and it was considered part of the job. And therefore they flooded. Hagistati, the famous case, was found to have no eardrum in his left ear, and in his right ear partial remains of an eardrum. There are stories that we heard about on Kalimnos last year that this was a standard practice. A neophyte diver going down with the Skandalapetra, that's say the stone, that you held in both hands, and you went down with it, you held it above your head and went down straight with it. First of all, how are you going to equalize in those days? The concept of the nose clip hadn't come in, and you couldn't let go of the stone with one hand and equalize. So there we are. They were, as I understand it, when they first began their career as a sponge diver, in the first dives, they would go down, the kids were probably quite young, 11 years old, 12 years old, or something like this could be, burst their eardrums, came back crying and explaining that they were hurt and etc., and they were also probably very giddy. And they were told, well, that's what the job is. Okay, so much for that one. That was the only cases that we know of, or certainly that I know of effectively head down flooding. All the rest of the flooding that's been done has been done in a head-up position. There have been experiments carried on, I understand, by both Sebastian Morat, who I was corresponding with for some time ago, and also with Eric Fatter. But none of them seem to be particularly successful. I've seen no evidence of them having been really successful. We have definitely seen the success of Pippin's techniques in his student Patrick Mosimo, who was the first person to get to 209 meters using that technique. And of course his wife Audrey, who had, before her death, which was nothing to do with her diving ability, but only safety protocols, had successfully dived to 170 meters with no problems, and she was also, of course, using her husband's technique. This, I think, is his legacy to freediving, and whatever can be said or not said about the man, it would be incredibly stupid, in my opinion, to dismiss this, and to dismiss him when he has left us what may be a magnificent legacy. So here are two techniques that would have minimized his exposure to decompression sickness. So it shows us, let me conclude this thing, it shows us that we have to be very, very wary of statistics compiled on the basis of accidents that have turned up in a recompression facility. Simply because I think that these sort of questions were not asked, not noted, and I think it would be very hard to, with the limited statistics we've got, to extrapolate really empirical conclusions from them. So I would suggest to people that they, when they get information like this, that they don't react knee-jerk, but try and understand and examine what's happening here, and that may help to increase their own knowledge of the trade-offs that we have in deep freediving. So that's the first thing. Then we had another thing appearing this week that was interesting. It was a competition, I believe, in Indonesia of the summer divers who were doing using essentially exactly the same technique as the Greek sponge divers used when they were diving with the Skandalopetra. That they were dropping with a weight. In one of them was dropping, the person who did the most depth in this competition, which was 79 meters, dropped in a head-down position. The person who did second, took second place in this, dropped in a feet-first position. Okay, what was interesting to see was that they were wearing large volume masks that we would have said were the sort of thing that you might pick up in a supermarket or something, that you know, masks for kids that are packaged with a set with a snorkel, a pair of plastic fins, and this huge mask. So it looked very funny. One of them, certainly the one who was going down head down, you could see no sign of either cheek fill or of him using his hands to equalize. So here we go. The guy was doing apparently BTV, hands-free equalization, BTV, béance tubulaire volontaire, yeah, which means a voluntary opening of the eustachian tubes, just manipulating the muscles that open the eustachian tubes and allowing the air and allowing the ears to equalize. Now, he was doing this apparently without any big or massive cheek fills in, which would have been obvious on the film that we saw. Very interesting, because particularly there was a remark by one of the observers there who said that they were doing a partial exhalation before they went down. Wow. That might complicate all our concepts about equalizing considerably. What was their secret? I think when we look at these things, we tend to skim over without thinking about it. Because the only way that we're going to go forward in freediving today is if we're open-minded enough to start questioning nearly everything and to dismiss nothing offhand. So if I achieve any other point in this discussion, it will be that, to get you wondering, hey, how do they do this? Is it a good idea? There's a young Australian, I think I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry, and I apologize to him deeply if he ever listens to this, who is doing 154 meters apparently dynamic in the pool on FRC. Wow. The accepted concept today, particularly for pool divers, is that you pack until your brains explode out of your head. And the general accepted dictum is that you've got to have something like an anvil round your neck after you've packed to an absurd extent in order to get to a world record today. This is supported by the evidence. The most successful pool divers are in fact doing that. But is this the way of the future? There is a limitation in this. Let's consider other alternatives here. I'm playing around with ideas to see if I can get you interested in directions that freediving might take in the future. One of the questions that I've asked scientists for a very long time, I'll come to. It is known that the secrets of the phenomenal diving abilities of the elephant seal, where he's going down to something like 1,800 meters and stuff like this, feeding and spending colossal lengths of time down there and doing repetitive dives, is largely due to the fact that he has one huge difference in his physiology from ours. They have other things as well, diving adaptations that, if we have them, they're embryonic. Not all our reflexes are embryonic. Our dive reflexes are embryonic. Some of them are incredibly good, considering that we're land animals. But the one I'm talking about is, of course, the myoglobin to hemoglobin ratio. With them, it's practically the converse from what we have. We have a very small percentage of myoglobin and a very large percentage of hemoglobin. The myoglobin, in my understanding, allows you to use your muscles as a kind of oxygen bank. You can store or saturate them with oxygen, and with the help of the myoglobin, myoglobin helps to scavenge the oxygen, as I understand it, from the muscles. My question has always been, okay, we have the reverse. Can we alter the ratio, our ratio between myoglobin and hemoglobin at all? I have had categorical answers from some scientists. Absolutely not. It's all DNA and then governed by DNA and blah, 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 blah. One physiologist who I very much respect, Aleksei, took the question more seriously and said that there were some intimations in research that had been done on high altitude climbers that one might lead one to suppose that possibly this balance of myoglobin, hemoglobin actually was capable of being altered, or was or altered itself by continued exposure. A very interesting question. We know that most of the marine mammals, the really deep divers, dive with empty lungs. This also limits their exposure to decompression sickness. It also puts a huge emphasis on what I call the oxygen scavenging system. She won? This leads us into ways of thinking that to me are incredibly interesting. I think the first people to give up on packing, for instance, will be the deep divers, because the risks very soon begin to outweigh the benefits. And I'm talking particularly about narcosis here. Also, of course, if you're capable of packing, I don't know, 20% more, think of the huge amount of effort in terms of overcoming extra buoyancy on the way down and the delayed point at which you go into the glide and all kinds of other things. So if we do train in a different fashion, I found something quite interesting here, that if I train static or dynamic on empty lungs, it doesn't necessarily cross over into improving hugely my dynamic or static in a pool. If my dynamic and the static in the pool are done on full lungs. But you very quickly get to distances that surprise yourself and results in static that surprise yourself. Static less so, more particularly in dynamic, yeah, that surprise yourself, and the speed at which you progress, if you're training empty lungs or FRC, is quite astonishing. And one of the best, one of the really, really nice things about it is that you don't have to wear an anvil of 20 kilos around your neck. And to me, we are approaching the end of a particular technique. This has happened before in freediving. The people supposed that you had to do this in order to achieve results. Hyperventilation for one thing. Yeah. And after it was absolutely accepted as written in stone that you couldn't get anywhere without it, you know, we suddenly realized it was probably one of the biggest inhibitors to performance and one of the biggest dangers. So techniques have changed, and that's not the only one, but it's the first one that immediately jumps into mind. And I think we're approaching the end of that story, even in the pool. Yes, today 283 meters dynamic is a colossal number. And before somebody does anything approaching that, FRC will take a long time. But how many people are actually training that way? And if they committed to training that way, actually how long would it take before we could get comparable results? Until somebody, a penguin, actually jumps off the ice floe and is the first penguin of the herd to do it. And here again, the 154 meter dynamic that was done on FRC, I think, is the first penguin. And I applaud it very much because I've been messing with this idea for a long time. I think that it's something that's very, very interesting. We may have to evolve whole new techniques of freediving, whole new approaches to the idea of ventilation, whole new ideas on everything, from how we balance ourselves, right the way down the line. And Come on, guys. Sometimes it's fun to look forward, even if we know that we're not going to do this for the next competition. Yeah, because we'd have to train that way for a long time. We'd have to go backwards before we could go forwards. Then maybe it won't be you that does it. I remember this very particularly in the first, no, it was, I believe it was the second competition, freedive competition, international one, that took place in, if I'm right, Sardinia. And I think the year was 1998. As far as I remember, there was one monofinner there. Now, here's the ticket. Umberto had done 80 meters in bifins as the world record, round about that, even before that, I think. And certainly he'd done his 73 meters before that. Nobody in the competition, except one lone individual, as I remember it, used a monofin. Now, the arguments in those days were monofin or bifin. And the bifin was king, indisputably. Here, all the records, all the champions were using a bifin. Who on earth would plunk for the monofin? I actually had a conversation with Umberto on that. He said, look, he said, my sponsors, which were Cressy, Agib, and several others, expect me to do a record every year. Now, we have a saying that comes from, if you like it, military history, which is that a victorious army never changes its tactics. And this is very true, and it's true of champions in freediving. If what you did last year got you a record, be it national or be it world record, you're unlikely to experiment with something that is unproven, totally radical in another direction, that we don't know the results of for next year. So here we go. How many bifins do you see in competition today? Well, we did see one colossal dive in Roatan recently by William Winram, who did, I believe, 94 meters there in the bifin, which is colossal. But other than that, I can't really recall that many bifins in international competitions, and certainly not amongst the elite divers. Now, if you'd said that in 1998, everybody would have said, poor chap, he's lost his marbles. So, and they would have suggested nice things like this funny little jacket that ties at the back where your arms are crossed like that, where you might not do yourself any great harm. They might have suggested all kinds of nice things, and you would have been called completely crazy. I think the thing that really convinced me to change over to a monofin was a very nice little story that I was attending the first foreign, that's to say non-Italian, instructors course of the Apnea Academy. This was in Santa Teresa di Gallora. It was, of course, conducted by Umberto Pellizzari himself. And there were a lot of the big older names from freediving there. Fred Boyle was there, Jean-Paul was there. There were an awful lot of advanced divers there. All of us, bar one, had a monofin. Had bifins. And it was the sort of some had longer bifins than others, and there were all sorts of things, and everybody was comparing lengths and stiffnesses and various other things. It sounded awfully pornographic to me. However, truth of the matter was that nobody paid any attention to a little guy who was there who didn't look particularly athletic. But he was in a monofin, took an awful lot of bullshit from everybody else who had made an awful lot of fun of him. He was a person who walked his own path, and he's a person who has always commanded my admiration greatly. Yes, Philip, that's you, Philip the Sither. And anyway, there were people who struggled on this course to do 50 meters in the bifin. 50 meters is quite deep in one. And here was Philip, who did not look the model of the normally accepted athlete, a little bit rotund. He wasn't 20 years old, and he was bouncing up and down very happily to 50 meters, and it wasn't bothering him in the least. So I went back to wherever I was at the time. I can't remember whether it was Israel or Greece or wherever, and had a little soul searching on this subject. And it coupled with the conversation I'd had with Umberto that, hey, even if he wanted to, and he had been a butterfly swimmer, but he was afraid to commit himself to a new technique, a new piece of equipment, and swimming in an entirely different fashion to depth, when, as far as he was concerned, there was nothing proven out there. And so far he'd been operating very, very successfully with his bifins. And one can see his point. So sometimes it's not the champions that one should be looking at. Philip taught me a huge amount, one of the big lessons there. More than just, maybe it's time you ought to really consider the monofin, which I did, of course, and we went over to training, and we actually went to the trouble of learning the technique correctly from the trainers from Tomsk in Russia, who were the trainers of the national fin swimming team. And I have sent other of my students to Tomsk to learn good technique from them. Okay. But I learned a lesson beyond that. I learned a lesson that you really have to think for yourself if you want to be a successful freediver. Not follow, like a lot of bleating sheep, what so-and-so is doing. We see this today, unfortunately, in beginning divers, in every international competition. You see a diver who is not going more than 30 meters. They might be doing 25 meters, packing like a maniac before they go down. And then there was even one diver who was diving less than 30 meters. After a single dive, went and paid for oxygen after it. Hello? This is just copying, presumably, the local champion, doing blindly what he does without examining, is this right for me? If you competition divers want to develop to your maximum, you're going to have to keep open-minded, question everything, and improve your knowledge. And sometimes not only reading eminent treatises on physiology and the latest things on physiology, but also looking backwards at what has been done and how it was done. One of my greatest fears today is that we are losing touch with our ancestors. Patrick Mosima, bless his heart, before he died, did a beautiful little movie that I'm sure wasn't complete, called Waving at My Ancestors. You can see it on YouTube. It's a little gem. He went and examined the techniques of the sponge divers in Greece and the Dodekanis, and he also knew something about the divers from the Persian Gulf and their techniques. There was a very, very good article about those divers and the early techniques of diving. I wish I could get a copy of this. There was a French magazine called L'Apnée, and they did a I don't know whether it was a yearly copy, one of the big copies that came out, not the usual monthly one, where they did a superb article on early divers and talked about their techniques. And it is really, really interesting to me that we don't lose touch with our past, because sometimes the past points a direction to the future that we haven't thought about. Other times we come out banging ourselves on the back and, wow, I thought of a new idea. New? That idea is 400 years old. What are you talking about? Yeah? So, I just wish that more people were researching more into what our ancestors were doing in freediving and understanding their techniques, how they dived, why they thought they dived that way. And there are some good little bits of research about that. There was the Moken people and their visual adaptations to diving underwater without goggles, which was extremely interesting. It shows the tremendous plasticity, the tremendous adaptability of our systems. Hey, we are marine mammals. Scratch us a little bit more and we'll find out. I think it's a fascinating subject. Okay, this is not one of the talks where you're going to get a huge tip that is going to boost your performance tomorrow in freediving. But it's a plea to try and encompass more in our knowledge of where we've been. Look always with a fresh mind at where we're going. And that's my particular rant for tonight. Thank you for watching. I'm just going to check whether we have any particular...
Cliff wanted to ask a question, but I don't see it really.
Okay, Cliff apparently wanted to ask a question, and...
Says excellent ground down so much.
Okay. I don't see anything in particular. I have a little thing from Cars that he raised with me earlier on in the day that is extremely interesting. And I'll talk about it for about 3 or 4 minutes. This can be a tip that can help an awful lot of people, particularly beginning to intermediate divers who are struggling with frenzel and struggling with equalization. It can well be that when they've corrected everything from the good book, that they're going down without looking towards the bottom, which is of course not conducive to good equalization. When they have got the timing of the equalization correct, and where they've got all the movements inside the mouth and everywhere else correct, still they're finding one ear jams. The other ear goes on happily. Now, here's the thing. They're doing a correct frenzel, but somewhere around 15 to 16 meters or 12 to 16 meters, suddenly it doesn't work. Okay, the first thing that anybody, a trainer, would do is do all the checks. Okay, you are doing a correct frenzel, you're not using your diaphragm, you're not doing a Valsalva, yeah? What's the problem? That's when they start going to the ear, nose and throat specialist, and they start imagining all kinds of difficulties, because it's always the same. My right ear won't equalize. My left goes like a piece of cake. Well, if your left goes with a piece of cake, if you put a light in your mouth and you see that your tongue action is correct, then it's one thing. Very, very rarely, almost never, is it a question of a physiological thing that doesn't allow you to equalize. Mostly the answer can be found in your diet. Here we get onto the subject of allergies. Allergies are a very funny thing. If you go to a doctor and you have allergies, at least I had it years and years and years ago. I don't know whether they've changed it. The doctor would have a nice little board with dozens of little bottles on it of weird liquids. Yeah, and he would make little scratches on your arm, on the inside of your arm. Yeah, and he would put a drop on each little scratch or pinprick. And if there was a reaction, that showed that you were allergic to dog hair, to mimosa, to household dust, to work. No, sorry, can't talk about that one. Anyway, the thing about allergies is simply this. None of us, if we're allergic, are allergic to a single thing. We're usually allergic to several things, or even an awful lot of things. So how does an allergic attack work? An allergic attack works like water building up behind a dam. Yeah? Household dust goes up. Grass pollen goes up. Mimosa goes up. And it keeps on, each little thing, yeah, it keeps on going up a little bit more and a little bit more. Household dust going up. I'm allergic to the cat going up. And then finally we get to something. Now those things, we don't have too much control about our exposure to them, because they're there in the environment. Some we can avoid a bit. I mean, we can throw the cat out, or if that's the case. Though God forbid in my house, the cat rules here. But however, these are things that basically we can't control. But there are things, and they're the things that could bring us over the top, like water going over a dam into a reaction that would be unfavorable to us. And this is food allergies. Apart from very specific ones like peanuts and shellfish and stuff like this, or nightshade vegetables and fruit. The two main ones are, of course, all wheat products, all gluten, yeah, and milk products. And somebody a long time ago tried to relate these to blood groups. That X blood group, O, was more prone to, let's say, grain allergies. I can't remember exactly how that particular theory worked, but here's the ticket. Unquestionably, we can suddenly have improve our equalization performance miraculously by cutting out bread, wheat products, all gluten out of our diet, and also all milk products. This may be very severe. Now, you can sort of do it week by week. You can say, 1 week I'm going to cut out all milk products and see if this improves the situation. If it doesn't, then the problem is probably not milk products. Then you look at wheat products. You bring back the milk and cut out the wheat. And by a process of elimination, you can usually find out what's going on. And I've had people who have had dramatic improvements in their diving performance by doing out one or other or both of those two things, milk products and all wheat and gluten. So I leave you with that thought. Carl said he also had an awful lot of other improvements when he gave up wheat products, better sleep, better lactic performance, and a whole bunch of other things. And so let me leave you with that thought.
There's a question.
Okay, we have one last question.
Cliff Edsel asks you, as an underwater photographer, filmmaker who uses the waterway by fin and typically not dropping past 10-20 meters, is cardio training applicable, and if so, what would you recommend for land-based training, if anything?
Cliff, that's a huge question. That's going to take an hour to answer. First of all, I'm not quite sure what how the waterway fins come into this. Yes, a fin that is too stiff for you is not a good idea. And an awful lot of people have the romance that for depth you need a really stiff fin. Yeah, if you really like lactic acid, go for it. Okay, is cardio training applicable, and if so, what would you recommend for land-based training, if anything? Okay, there's an awful lot that I would recommend for land-based training. I would recommend flexibility. We always recommend very heavy emphasis on neck flexibility to protect anybody from anything to do with squeezes. Okay, it's unlikely at 10 meters. Still, thoracic flexibility is a very, very good idea. So Udayana and the ball exercises that we do are a brilliant idea for that. Breath walk and various static exercises, which I won't go into now because that's a whole training program which would take me another 6 hours to talk about. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you with that one and say, yes, I would train breath hold exercises, both static and things like breath walk. I would train flexibility. Particular cardio fitness, it depends on the level of your unfitness at the moment. Obviously, you get better heart performance if you've got a minimum level of fitness. For somebody who is going for more serious training, yes, of course, one wants to put a huge emphasis on both anaerobic and lactic exercise. Cardio is a very general word. If you had said to me more specifically aerobic, anaerobic or what, we might have a discussion on the thing. Cardio in general terms, if you're incredibly unfit, yes, some aerobic exercise is definitely a good idea. But for those particular things, it's not the prime choice. Let's put it that way. Cardio is not the prime thing. It will come from other forms of training, but we can discuss that at a different time. I'm sorry, Cliff, it's just too big a subject to deal with in this particular session.
Cliff just wanted to mention that for him it was the removal of gluten, wheat, that improved his health in general.
Okay, I hope you heard that. Cliff said that huge improvement in his health by removing gluten and wheat. Well, an awful lot of people are saying that. Yeah, and for an awful lot of different reasons. Of course, in talking basically about the whole business of inflammation, etc., etc. So I don't want to get into that. That's another huge subject. I'm way over time tonight, and I'm getting myself hugely unpopular here because my partner is absolutely fascinated by a program called Big Brother. And Alice sits...
He's talking about the cat.
Yeah, Alice sits and watches it passionately every evening, and we pretend that we can't stand the damn thing.
I want to thank everybody for joining, and Cliff and the rest of the people who joined. You're welcome to ask questions through the whole 2 weeks that we have between webinars, and this way we'll have a better way to plan the answers and the time in general.
Yeah, it's difficult to suddenly get after an hour of yapping, which is my kind of a limit, to get a question that would take 6 hours to answer. So if you can feed me your questions in any form, join the 2 weeks in between, I'd be very grateful to you. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm always looking for suggestions about things that you would like me to yap about.
If everything will go by
don't
the plan...
be scared to tell me to shut up if that's your particular persuasion too. Anyway, good night from all of us in Freedivers. Yeah, that's Alice there, who is by far the most photogenic member.
The next webinar, if everything will go by the plan, will be on the 10th of September.
Okay, the 10th of September is our next meeting. We haven't chosen a subject for it yet. We're at your disposal. So it only remains to thank you for looking at this tonight or whenever you have a chance to look at it. I hope it will record. And safe diving, and enjoy until the next time that we meet. Good night.
Good night.